In the spring of 1961, something strange began inside a modest apartment on Rose Street in New York. The home of Mrs. Maybelle Clark became the center of a chilling mystery, one of the most unusual poltergeist cases ever documented. The disturbances seemed to follow her grandson, a 13-year-old boy named Ernest Rivers. On the night of his birthday, as he sat working on his homework, he noticed something impossible. A pepper shaker drifted through the air and came to rest beside him. That single moment was only the beginning. From then on, glasses, plates, and cups would lift from their places and crash across the rooms almost every day. At first, Mrs. Clark tried to keep the incidents quiet. She only told close family members and a few trusted friends, but secrets have a way of spreading. Soon, neighbors began to whisper, and reporters arrived, hungry for a ghost story. Mrs. Clark refused to let them take pictures of herself or of Ernest. She feared people might think they had lost their minds. One of the first officials to look into the case was Irving Laskowitz from the New York Housing Authority. He searched the home, questioned both grandmother and grandson, and admitted he found no sign of anyone faking the events. In fact, he remarked that it almost would have been easier if it had been a prank, because mischievous children were far simpler to deal with than something unseen. Laskowitz then suggested that Mrs. Clark and her grandson move to another apartment, but she told him she didn't believe the disturbances would last forever. But the haunting only grew worse. One evening, as Mrs. Clark and Ernest ate dinner in the kitchen, 4 cups suddenly rose out of a punch bowl in the living room. They flew across the apartment and smashed on the kitchen floor. A light bulb became unscrewed from a floor lamp in Ernest's bedroom and shattered. A bottle of disinfectant toppled from the bathroom shelf and smashed to pieces on the tile floor. And once, a small mirror in Ernest's bedroom fell and was cracked. By this time, news of the disturbances had aroused the neighborhood. Mrs. Clark's tenant friends, eager to help, or just to witness the antics of the ghost for themselves, showed up frequently at the apartment. Often, Mrs. Clark, frightened and glad to have company, let them in. In this way, several people were able to confirm that something unusual was definitely going on. One of these, Mrs. Cordelia Holland, who lived on the 3rd floor of the complex, said that they were in the kitchen, and suddenly she saw a glass decanter on top of the refrigerator start to move toward the edge. She yelled and caught it just in time. She put it back and made sure it was in the middle of the refrigerator top. But a half-hour later, when they weren't looking, they heard a crash and found the decanter on the floor. Another time, Mrs. Clark, Ernest, and 2 women friends were having coffee in the kitchen when suddenly they were amazed to see a jar of Vaseline, known to have been on the bathroom shelf, come whizzing through the pantry area, veer around a corner, and land with a thud on the living room rug. As the days went by, Mrs. Clark's initial fear almost left her. It was replaced by anger at having to clean up the contents of smashed bottles and pick up the broken glass. On the 6th day of the occurrences, a heavy electric steam iron rose from its position on a storage shelf in the hall and sailed into Mrs. Clark's bedroom. Its cord was trailing straight out behind it, like the tail of a kite. The amazed Mrs. Clark watched as it came to rest on the floor. She later remarked that she never would have believed her eyes had she been alone. But she wasn't. Mrs. Holland was sitting with her in the bedroom and saw it too. A few days later, James Moore, a New York Housing Authority executive, and Ward Ulrich, a New York Star-Ledger reporter, were both in the Clark apartment. Ulrich was standing in a hallway when he heard someone give a low wail. He whirled around just in time to see a bottle zip through the air and land in Mrs. Clark's bedroom. Ulrich picked it up, and both men saw that it was a medicine bottle with a plastic cap. It had been resting on one of the hall shelves before it became airborne. During this event, Ernest was seen to be standing just inside his own room. Later, Ulrich said he doubted that the boy could have thrown the bottle from where he was standing. Ulrich closely questioned Mrs. Clark, Ernest, and other witnesses about the odd events. They were all convinced that what they had seen were real happenings, and that no trickery was involved. According to Ulrich, these witnesses were rational and normally intelligent people. None of them seemed emotional or hysterical. On some nights, the boy and his grandmother sought escape from the disturbances at the home of Mrs. Clark's daughter and her husband, Ruth and William Hargwood. At such times, no strange activity ever took place. By this point, psychical researchers had also become interested in the case. When reporters asked for their opinions, many suggested that emotionally disturbed youngsters might be responsible for such disturbances. Naturally, suspicion began to fall on young Ernest. One newspaper even labelled him the boy who makes things fly. And in Ernest's case, there were reasons why people thought this way, because his young life had been filled with trauma and emotional pain. Back in 1956, Ernest's mother, Anne Clark Rivers, had killed his father, who was a professional boxer. During her trial, she testified that on that night she dreamed her husband was going to shoot her with a gun he kept in their bedroom. Frightened and still half asleep, Anne grabbed the gun and shot him first. She pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to serve 18 to 22 years in a women's reformatory. After that, Ernest went to live with his grandparents in New York. Then in 1960, his grandfather passed away. By mid-May, Mrs. Clark's apartment had become a crowded place. Visitors constantly showed up. Some wanted to investigate, others came to help, and many were simply curious to see the boy who makes things fly. At this point, a New York University professor of psychology, Dr. Charles Reg, entered the picture. He had long been fascinated by poltergeist cases, and he visited the Clark apartment several times. Slowly, he gained the trust of both Mrs. Clark and Ernest. On 3 different visits while Ernest was present, Dr. Reg personally saw objects flying through the air, propelled by some unseen force. But each time, the boy was not even close to the spot from where the objects had moved. Reg carefully measured distances, checked every corner, and examined all the objects to make sure no tricks were being played. He soon became convinced that Ernest was not physically responsible. Then came the night of May 13th. Around 10 o'clock, William Hargwood arrived to take his mother-in-law and Ernest back home with him. At that very moment, a glass ashtray suddenly snapped in half with a loud crack. Mrs. Clark, shaken by what she saw, immediately phoned Dr. Reg, just as she had promised to keep him informed of the next incident. Within minutes, the professor arrived and found Ernest and his grandmother preparing to leave. He asked Mrs. Clark if Ernest could stay behind with him, hoping that more events might happen while they were alone. Though frightened, she reluctantly agreed and left with her son-in-law. Soon after, the professor and Ernest were sitting in the kitchen when a loud crash echoed from the living room. Rushing in, they found a table lamp lying shattered on the floor. Professor was certain the boy hadn't touched it. Ernest had been right beside him the entire time. He even checked the lamp, its plug and its cord, but found no sign of wires or tricks. Barely 10 minutes later, the two were back in the kitchen when another startling event occurred. A glass standing on the sink's drain board slowly lifted into the air and then shattered on the floor. What made this moment stranger was that both of them swore the glass broke before it even touched the ground, and William Hargwood also returned. As the men and Ernest prepared to leave, the final event soon followed. Ernest stood nervously in the hallway near the front door, ready to leave. Professor and William were still in the living room when they saw a salt shaker fly in from the kitchen. It struck William on the head, though luckily he wasn't injured. This time, Professor was absolutely certain. Ernest had not thrown it. That night, the Professor, Ernest, and William wasted no time in leaving. Ernest stayed with his aunt and uncle for several weeks. And when he finally returned to live with his grandmother, the disturbances had ended. It was a unique case not only because of the number of events, over 50 separate incidents, but also because it happened inside a public housing complex. Every occurrence centered around one small apartment, and every time Ernest was present. Whatever the true cause, whether paranormal or psychological, many believed the strange activity was linked to the unconscious energy of an emotionally troubled boy.